So today I'm going to be talking about three poems which I think offer interesting approaches to the various temporalities associated with climate change, and I focus in particular on how digital media and poetic forms shape our experience of and in these strange new times. This first quote is from a section of Joshua Clover and Juliana Sparr's acerbic hashtagged Misanthropocene 24 Theses, a poem not so much about climate change specifically as about the Anthropocene in general.
And fuck this list with its mixture of environmental destruction and popular culture smugness, and fuck every one of you that laughed at that rock banjo joke, and fuck us all for writing it, and fuck not just the Google bus but the Google doc this poem rode in on, and fuck us for sitting here reading you a rock banjo joke while the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse went extinct. Fuck that this happened 2 days and 20 hours ago, and fuck that next up is the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog, because we've always liked frogs, their vulnerable skin, our vulnerable skin.
One thing I noticed when I discussed this poem in class is that my students wanted to read it very fast, unsurprising given the anaphoric sentences which, as this fairly representative section shows, heap ecological and political outrages on top of each other while barely pausing to curse. The poem moves from the circulating jokes and memes of pop culture smugness into the all too material extinctions occurring even as one reads the poem. This sense of a disaster occurring even as one slows down to take it in is something we are familiar with in relation to climate change. The poem's title too has implications for temporality. If the Anthropocene names a geological epoch where human impact leaves a detectable and pervasive mark on the strata of deep geological time, then by implication a Misanthropocene names a concomitant cultural epoch, one typified by a detectable and pervasive misanthropism arising from disgust or horror at the impact of humans on the planet. One could probably have almost as much fun as the International Commission on Stratigraphy's Anthropocene Working Group in trying to find a kind of cultural golden spike to mark the Misanthropocene's beginning. I personally reckon a good case could be made for 1962, not only the year when Silent Spring was published, but the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment when nuclear brinksmanship made lots of people wonder what our species' new technological capacities might mean for life on Earth. It is also important not to forget the hashtag which appears in the poem's title, although less so in the body of the poem. That hashtag, as ever, serves to highlight the speed, ease and flippancy with which we share things online, including, of course, eco-critics' ability to continuously tweet news of present and future climate change into their online echo chambers, accompanied with the appropriately environmentally conscious hashtag. Hashtag slow violence, hashtag this changes everything, hashtag Cli-Fi. Sparr and Clover's poem suggests that while there may be a place for this sort of clicktivism, it also potentially enervates critical engagement and offline modes of resistance. Now, this concern with how digital technologies shape our engagement with climate change also plays a big part in the recent work of Jonty Tiplady. To take a line from a poem which I reference in my title,
on my Nokia phone at 1:16 a.m. on Monday, 22nd September 2014, I can see that someone has written climate change in capital letters on Facebook. In 3 minutes it's gone.
What to make of this intriguing disappearance? Is Tiplady suggesting that, despite concern with climate change surely being as valid a concern as any, the sort of self-congratulatory virtue signalling of writing about climate change on one's wall is too much even for Facebook's supremely onanistic modes of online communication? Or is it because the post has already been swept up in endless feed, driven down the page not only by selfies and pug gifs, but by other causes du jour, like the irresistible rise of Donald Trump, the plight of refugees landing in Lesbos, or the implications of a bungled Brexit? Though of course none of these issues should be seen as isolated from the interconnected concerns of climate change. When I contacted Tiplady to ask his permission to quote this poem, he read my abstract and wrote back to say that this was actually based on a real event, and you can see his email here. I love his description of the disappearance of the phrase climate change as, quote, a glimpsed moment squeezed out by the psychospatial repression network that is Facebook as everything now. It's worth relating what Tiplady is saying in his email, and indeed his essays and poems, to the recent arguments advanced by the philosopher Bernard Stiegler. As many of you watching will be aware, Stiegler's work in the last 2 decades has centred around how techniques determine our relationship with memory and therefore time. He analyses how memories are embedded within technological systems that order memories according to their own logics. So for example, we might think about how books or magazines, television or Instagram each order individual and cultural memory in different ways. Stiegler is also concerned with what he calls hyperstandardization, which in essence is the synchronization of the time of consciousness at a global level, not least thanks to the pressure the culture industry exerts on our subjectivity. Or, as the poem puts it,
climate changes and Jennifer Lawrence wears a hot Emilio Pucci crop top.
In 2 fascinating but difficult essays for public seminar, including the magnificently titled Theses on the Philosophy of the FKA Anthropocene featuring Shia LaBeouf, Tiplady describes how Stiegler sees this corporatisation of our senses as related to, quote, a kind of winding down and short-circuiting of all cognitive capacities and to a global attention deficit disorder that makes it impossible to focus on what needs to be focused on, i.e. mental entropy. In a much downloaded essay, Escaping the Anthropocene, Stiegler describes the Anthropocene as an Entropocene. For Stiegler, we have to take arms against this mental entropy and interrupt this fall towards supreme inertia via a kind of reactivation of care and particularity. Now, I don't have time in this video paper to adequately detail all the ways that Tiplady challenges aspects of Stiegler's urgency in his open forum essays, where, comparing Stiegler to Shia LaBeouf's Just Do It performance video, Tiplady criticises what he describes as Stiegler's Just Do It exhortations, suggesting that Stiegler's argument risks tipping into the same hectoring and finally desperate tone as we find in LaBeouf's made-to-be-memed motivational video.
Yes, you can! Just do it! If you're tired of starting over, stop giving up.
Part of Tiplady's concern in both essays is that Stiegler's urgency risks too quickly retrenching a new position, and also that Stiegler does not adequately address the potential failure of any attempts to resist the Anthropocene in the face of climate change, hence the almost inevitable relapse into some sort of unsatisfactory behaviour. The sort of questions lurking behind any exhortation to engage with climate change right now are questions like, what exactly is it that I'm supposed to resist? What are we supposed to do? And what good is that anyway? Should we be trying to stop melting ice caps, Arctic drilling, stronger hurricanes? How? Write to our MP, vote for green candidates that won't get in, eat less meat, buy more Priuses, write opinion pieces excoriating Priuses as just another instance of inadequate greenwashing for corporations like Uber, walk more, ride more, copulate more but procreate less, protest more, garden more, read more poetry, while consistently acknowledging that that makes nothing happen. The range of possible modes for engaging with climate change is always trumped by the associated ever-proliferating matters of concern. I'd suggest that this is perhaps why both Tiplady and Spar and Clover adopt these lists, where the repeated phrases appear to move the poem inexorably forward, while also piling emerging environmental issues alongside the on and offline banalities that dominate our practice of everyday life. The scale and scope of climate change issues means that any thought-through attempt to engage with environmental questions might well tip into doubt, paralysed despair, or even cynicism. Feelings that I suspect anyone watching this video has experienced at least to some degree when trying to visualise potential climate futures. Such feelings undermine the capacity to seize the moment and to take action to prevent and mitigate climate change's most severe impacts. As Elizabeth Callaway puts it in her fascinating essay on messianic time and climate change, a moment seized could be a moment grasped or taken up, or it could be a moment paralysed and seized up. We may not be able to force the moment into its crisis. The time may not be now, or, in Tiplady's terms, we can't just do it. It's that tipping forth between hope and despair in the face of the future that I want to pick up in my third poem, Now, this excerpt is from Jory Graham. The poem is Positive Feedback Loop from her 2008 collection Sea Change, which is published by Echo.
I am listening in this silence that precedes. Forget everything, start listening. Tipping point, flash, point. Convective chimneys in the seas bounded by Greenland.
Any attempt to find a moment in which to contemplate is interrupted by the changing biosphere which the reader has helped shape. A flashpoint is the temperature at which a liquid ignites, a kind of tipping point between material states. In Graham's poem, there is a strong suggestion that the biosphere may already have met a key tipping point where positive feedback loops kick in, causing runaway climate change. The poem continues to move between the individual and the global across a grid of long, medium and short lines that mix together religious and scientific language.
In hell, they empty your hands of sand. They tell you to refill them with dust and try to hold in mind the North Atlantic deep water, which also contains contributions from the Labrador Sea and entrainment of other water masses. Try to hold a complete collapse in the North Atlantic drift, in the thermohaline circulation. This will happen. Fish are starving to death in the Great Barrier Reef. The new age of extinctions is now. Says the silence that precedes. You know not what. You are entering a time beyond belief.
As well as the movement of fluids, the word entrainment can refer to brain activity and other forms of synchronization with an external pattern, such as circadian rhythms. Humans here cannot entrain themselves or, as the internal rhyme suggests, conceptually contain the movements of the hydrosphere. Rather, the infernally difficult attempt to conceptualize marine ecology results in damnation for multiple species in this new age of extinction. The sounds of time are replaced by the dust of death. Meltwater changes the temperature and salinity of the thermohaline circulation, potentially leading to a collapse in plankton, meaning that time is running out to stop certain fish populations and those life forms which depend on them starving to death. While human agency is far from the only player in this world of positive feedback loops, the current state of climate science means that our species is no longer able to claim that they know not what they do. The question is now not fully knowing what we have done. As the poem has it, humans know not what they are entering. It is a time beyond belief and beyond final control. Whether deniers believe in anthropogenic global warming or not is secondary. This will happen, whether they like it or not. But what does this refer to? Does it mean a future that will happen if things proceed as they are, a possible or even probable future? Or does it mean a future that is already written? Have we already passed a tipping point where positive feedback such as exponential ice melt, destabilised currents and, later in the poem, methane clathrate release kick in to make for the severe warming that is the stuff of apocalyptic cli-fi? Is this an unavoidable future that, to bastardise the words of William Gibson, is already here, just unevenly distributed? Whether positive feedback loop speaks to an undesirable or unavoidable future, what makes the poem and the collection so compelling is the attempt to register this feeling of catastrophic futurity on a formal level via the play between line and sentence. In an interview, Graham described her shift to the alternation of very long and very short lines spread over cascading sentences as a new stylistic choice. Letting the sentences move along this grid of very long and very short lines, feeding both of those prior socially aware poets, and she's talking about Walt Whitman and William Carlos Williams, in my ear, I was also able to enact a sense of tipping point, the feeling of falling forward or down in the hyper short lines at the same time as one feels suspended as long as possible in the here and now of the long line, so that the pull of the future is constrained by the desire to stay in the now, which is itself broken again, as a spell is, by the presence of an oncoming future. This also involves a tipping back and forth between hope and the brink of its opposite. A tension forms between a line long enough to contain multitudes, currents, land masses, species, and the short, sharp slap of a climate future that is increasingly here and now, although its most extreme effects that have yet to manifest. As Jory Graham asks in the same interview, does time flow uniformly? Does it fray or gather? Does it bunch up? Does it thicken? Poetry is one site where we might answer her, all of the above, of course. Poetry's density, the type of concentration it requires, its ability to measure out time in the line, to flick between both the instant and the long view, between here and there, between now, then and potential whens, mean that it offers a space to gather and negotiate the different types of time central to thinking about climate change. The time it will take the Earth to warm 2 degrees, to transition to renewables, to fly to a conference because the train would have taken too long. The time it took for that ice cap to melt, for a species to go extinct 252 million years ago, for a levee to be breached, to tweet one's outrage, to read a line aloud, to reread a poem. Awareness of such timeframes brings various types of action and inaction to the fore. It is through negotiating and rendering these starts and stutters, durations and endurances that poetry's ways of happening offer means of engaging with climate change that keyboard and touchscreen modes of communication may not. Thanks very much.